Okay, looks like it's 6 o'clock. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Sullivan, and I'm a Master Gardener trainee through the Central Gorge Master Gardener Association. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on Drought Tolerant Plants. This is the third of 6 Gardening to Save the World webinars, where we'll have Oregon State University professors sharing with us topics that relate to how home gardening can aid in saving our environment. As you're starting your gardens this spring, we also wanted to share with you that the Central Gorge Master Gardener plant clinics are still available to you virtually. Plant clinics are free opportunities for home gardeners to ask their questions, get research-based responses from our trained Master Gardener volunteers. These questions can be anything home gardener related. Don't be afraid to ask. Have you ever had odd holes in your plants, or have your leaves turned a weird color on your favorite plant? The Master Gardener volunteers can help you identify your problem so that you can find out what your next steps are. You can find the question submission form on one of these 2 websites listed here. The second link is where you registered for this webinar. Or you can leave us a phone message. You can expect to receive a reply with diagnosis and suggestions in about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the volume of client questions. Tonight, Neil Bell will be teaching us about drought-tolerant plants. Neil Bell was raised in Victoria, BC, and earned his BS degree from the University of British Columbia in plant science in 1990. He came to OSU to study horticulture and received a Master of Science in 1992. The research area for his master's degree was berry crops, and the thesis looked at the yield components of Marion trailing blackberry. Currently, Neil oversees the Master Gardener programs in Marion and Polk County. He also personally assists homeowners with their garden problems, typically about 300 inquiries per year. He has authored OSU Extension publications on water-efficient landscapes, soil amendment, and mulch use. He also revises the home garden sections of the Pacific Northwest Insect Management Handbook yearly, and he writes a weekly column entitled The Master Gardener Question of the Week for the Salem Statesman Journal. As an extension of his research activities, he is available to help community groups with design and installation of drought-tolerant landscapes anywhere in the Willamette Valley. If you have questions throughout the presentation, we're going to be using the Q&A box to post them, not the chat box that you see. We will be going through the Q&A questions, and we'll try to answer some at the end of the presentation. We'll follow up via email for any questions that don't get addressed tonight. So I'll take a moment, and you can look down at the bottom where you can find the Q&A, and we'll take a moment to transition to Neil to begin the presentation.
Hey, Kelly. So just share the screen?
Yep.
All right. I hope everybody can see that.
Yep. So now you can present.
Do I need to start recording, or is that
already recorded?
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly, for setting this up, and thank you, Megan, also for your assistance, and thanks to all of you for attending. I was asked by Kelly and Megan to do a presentation primarily on drought-tolerant plants, and I'll give my definition of what drought-tolerant plants are a little bit later in the presentation. But what I thought I would do is sort of give you a little overview of how I came to have an interest in this topic, and also some of the things that you can do to increase, if you like, or mitigate any lack of drought tolerance on plants that you may be planning on getting in your garden. There are ways of choosing planting locations that increases their drought tolerance, so to speak. But most of the presentation actually concerns a list of primarily shrubs. I focused on that just to keep it manageable. There's of course other things like annuals and some perennials. that are quite drought tolerant as well. But I thought shrubs are the one thing that can add a lot of impact to your garden. And by choosing well, you can end up with something in bloom during the majority of the year. So I'll talk a little bit about the plant, the way the plant list is arranged later on. So this is a picture I actually took about 3 hours ago in our garden. And we live 6 miles west of Monmouth in the woods, if you like, of Polk County. And when we bought our property in 1995, it there was no water to be had. It was a well that was required for the property. So we drilled our well, and there was enough water there to service the house and not enough for the landscape. So most of our landscape is not irrigated in the summertime, including the area you see in front of you. So that is part of my interest in this whole thing of drought tolerance. Is just it was a necessity if we wanted to have a garden out in Polk County. But in addition to that, together with my colleague in Yamhill County, Heather Stoven, and the researcher at North Willamette Research and Extension Center, Lloyd Knackley, we have a little program called Northwest Plant Evaluations. And the basic idea behind this program is we evaluate plants in unirrigated conditions in landscape situations over a number of years to see how they perform and how they behave, if you like, and grow without any summer irrigation at all. So that kind of gets at what my definition of a drought-tolerant plant is. Will it survive on what falls from the sky? So we've done a number of these evaluations. This shows an evaluation of about 40 cultivars of Ceanothus, which was actually done up at the Oregon Garden from 2001 to 2005, otherwise known as wild lilac. This shows our rock rose evaluation, which is at the place where I do most of my research in Aurora, Oregon, just south of Portland, the North Willamette Research and Extension Center. So this is rock roses. And so you can see this is how we arrange our evaluations. There's about 80 or 90 different rock rose cultivars in that one. And more recently, we did a study of manzanitas also at North Willamette from 2011 to 2019. And so our most recent one, and again, this is a photo I took today after doing a little weed management. This is an evaluation of ground covers. So it's not a specific genus. It is a collection of different plants from different genera, but all are intended to be used primarily as ground covers. So again, not irrigated. And what we collect on these is data on cold hardiness, flowering, any pest or disease problems, and also growth and size. So that was planted last fall, and we'll continue to monitor that for about another 3 or 4 years. So that's the interest in drought-tolerant plants. It's both personal in our own garden and professional as part of these research programs. So we live in an area which has a sort of temperate Mediterranean climate, you might say, which is a rather unique climate worldwide. Only about 2% of the world's land area is under a Mediterranean climate, which means basically it's a summer dry climate, so warm, dry summers and mild, wet winters. And so this is a map I stole from a book and reprinted. And notice the Mediterranean climate areas are primarily on the west-facing slope or west-facing sides of continents. And notice also that the North American area designated as Mediterranean is actually California, but Western Oregon and creeping into the gorge there also has this same kind of pattern. It's just not as pronounced as it is in California. So there's a couple of challenges to plant growth in these types of climate areas. One of them is summer drought, and the other is winter cold. So if you go to Southern California, which is where this photo was taken, of course, there's much less cold to deal with and more summer drought, if you like, that far south. In our region, and more specifically, this photo was taken in the gorge, what we deal with is more cold and less drought by comparison to Southern California. But either of those things is going to be sufficient to limit the performance of any given plant if they're not capable of tolerating both. So when I prepared the plant list, I tried to keep that in mind, is that, you know, cold, snow, freezing rain, those can be limiting factors for a lot of different plants. And so is drought tolerance. So drought tolerance inherently varies amongst plants. This is a planting in Corvallis, which shows some drought-stressed kinnikinic, whereas in the foreground is a very happy-looking Ceanothus or wild lilac, which is thriving under the same conditions that is causing the kinnikinic, in this case, to suffer drought tolerance. That photo was taken in August. And here's another example. It was taken in the wintertime, but it's collection of arborvitae growing along this little strip in Corvallis. And in between is a form of cherry laurel, which is a southeastern North European native, so more Mediterranean certainly than arborvitae. So the same plants under different plants under the same circumstances exhibit very different reactions to lack of water. So drought tolerance does vary. And then of course, so is cold. We have to take into consideration cold tolerance when we're considering planting in Western Oregon, and the same will apply, of course, to the Hood River Valley. This is an example of a plant which I really had a soft spot for. This is actually an Australian evergreen shrub, Grevillea lanigera coastal gem. And one of the things that I liked best about it was a relatively diminutive plant with nice gray foliage, but it flowered in the winter. And so this showed the plant in the fall one year, just starting to come into bloom. And this photo showed it about a month later after it had gotten subjected to, about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was enough, unfortunately, to dispatch the plant altogether. So since then, and this is one of the things that we actually monitor during our cold hardiness evaluations, is it capable of surviving in the ground long-term under our conditions. So we don't recommend coastal gem for gardens around here. But one of the things to keep in mind actually is that you can really extend above and beyond what we'll talk about, all of which should be suitable for use in the landscape. You can extend that gardening season by choosing plants for containers and then situate them in a way that they can be brought inside the house if it gets too cold. And so some of those things can be choice things which aren't suitable for the landscape. And this is an example which isn't hardy for us either in Monmouth, but I grew in a pot, and the photo shows this Grevillea. This is another species of Grevillea, sometimes called spider flower for the sort of appearance of the blooms. It was grown in a container, and when it would get really cold, I just bring it inside. But it would bloom all winter long, and so the hummingbirds really were fond of this particular plant. So that's another way to expand the palette of things that one can grow in the garden. Okay, so some things to consider about when you're thinking about drought tolerance of plants. Is the site where you're planning on planting them in full sun? In which case, of course, that will be maximum stress on the plant. Or is there some shade? Particularly afternoon shade, if the plant is capable of tolerating that, then the afternoon sun, of course, is the hottest and imposes the most stress on the plant. So if you can avoid afternoon sun, then you may be able to expand the range of things which will grow in your garden simply by adopting that technique. Shade from large plants can sometimes be a blessing and sometimes a problem, because a large fir like this one here will of course be significant competition for water. So you may be shading the plant, but you may also be subjecting it to a lot of competition for what water is in the soil. The site aspect will make a big difference. So if it's a west-facing or south-facing site, then that's hotter than a north or east slope, depending on the location in the garden. If the plants are placed next to any heat radiating surfaces, then again, there's an advantage and a disadvantage to that as well. The disadvantage is that if they're in sun when the surfaces are getting really hot, then that tends to increase water requirement for the plant simply because it makes the whole planting area hotter as well. The advantage is that in the wintertime, that may offer a possibility of growing something just a little bit tender for your growing region, because the added heat from that wall will provide the plant with some protection. Then the other thing that's really important is soil quality. So this is a real problem in some newer developments where the soil quality is substandard or there are problems with compaction. So this is something to take into consideration before you plant anything, is just doing whatever one has to do to create the most amenable soil environment for the plant you're planning on putting in the ground. And one of the more difficult problems to overcome is compaction. And you don't need any other soil problems other than compaction to cause a lot of grief for your plants. So that should be corrected. And the other thing which you want to avoid, or if you have to address it, is drainage problem, because virtually nothing landscape-wise will tolerate conditions such as this, where the soil remains saturated for long periods of time. So drainage problems really do need to be addressed before you plant. Okay, So I'm going to move along quickly here because I know I have until 7 o'clock. So I mentioned early on that I'd give you my definition of a drought-tolerant plant, and I've kind of alluded to that. And my definition of a drought-tolerant plant is a plant which, after a short establishment period, will grow and flower normally with minimal or no supplemental irrigation. I prefer the no supplemental irrigation because that enables one to forego utilizing an irrigation system of any kind, or having to haul out a hose and give it some water during the summertime. But anyway, that either of those circumstances, I think, defines a drought-tolerant plant. It doesn't mean the plants won't show stress. Typically they will, but the key thing is they'll grow and they will flower, which is, especially amongst flowering plants, of course, that's the thing that we're hoping to see, and the major ornamental asset of the plant. So we will use that as our working definition of a drought-tolerant plant for the ones that we'll discuss. So what I've done is this. I put together a list. It is not a comprehensive list, I guess you could say, and it is primarily a list of woody plants, just to kind of keep it a manageable list. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of native annuals and so forth, which are very drought tolerant. There are also perennials, which are quite drought tolerant as well. And then there's also additional woody plants not on the list, which would definitely meet that criteria. But the thing that I did was I tried to arrange them such that the beginning of the list, if you like, starts in the mid to late winter. So that's the bloom time for the plants, and then it extends through spring, summer, and into the following fall. So that's the way that the plant list that you'll see is arranged. We start for us anyway, in January. So what we've got is native flowering plants, which of course, by definition, if they're growing out in the wild, are surviving on whatever falls from the sky rain-wise, and then also non-native flowering shrubs as well. So they're intermingled during the remainder of the presentation. I didn't include things like cactus, some of which, of course, are hardy enough and also tolerant of the cold to grow in the ground here. As you can see in these examples, these are all in the Willamette Valley. And I didn't include coniferous plants. So this is about flowering plants, not conifers. I don't mean to suggest that they aren't totally tolerant of drought as well, but I decided to just sort of restrict myself to flowering shrubs in this presentation. And then, of course, as I mentioned, some of these are natives. So they're just a mix of both native and non-native as we go along. So let's start with silk tassel. And what I've done is put the common name and then the Latin name in brackets. And then over on the right, my best guess, and also I used as a resource, the Royal Hort Society Index of Garden Plants to provide information on the zone. Of course, as I mentioned, you can modify the growing environment in some cases, and maybe increase or at least make a little bit hardier some of the plants I described. But the zone information is a rough guide to where this plant is going to be hardy, because of course, within Hood River County, the farther one gets away from the river and the higher in elevation one goes, then the zones get lower and lower and lower. So silk tassel is a native shrub. You'll find it growing on the Oregon coast. We've grown it successfully in the Willamette Valley. It's it's a large evergreen shrub, so this thing takes a lot of room, first of all. Full sun, and if it's not a full sun plant, I will point that out. So most of the things I'm going to talk about are full sun. But its interest is this: it's a very textural plant, and it produces these catkins of flowers in January and early February. So if you've got a large full sun site, approximately 8 feet by 8 feet, then you can squeeze in one silk tassel plant. But texturally speaking, this really is different from anything else that we'll describe. And it is in bloom for us in the dead of winter. This is chaparral currant. I'll talk about other currants later on, including some native ones. But this is a native of Northern California. And it's proven to be surprisingly hardy here. And its main interest, this actually bridges the gap in flowering all the way from about the beginning of December through about the middle to the end of April. This plant will literally bloom during that whole time. And during that whole time, if the weather is warm enough, it will attract pollinators like honeybees and other native insects to the flowers, some of which are always in bloom during that time period. And the other thing that it attracts in abundance is hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are just very attracted to currants in general. And so this is probably the longest flowering plant that we have in our garden. It's really extraordinary. The flowers, it will continue to bloom through snow or even rain and ice. And so this just shows a photo of the flowers in bloom in January. Only the open flowers are vulnerable to freezes. The closed ones will then open after the freeze event passes. So it's a very tough shrub. And here's a fly which was finding the flowers on a warm February morning. The only thing you have to get used to is it's a Mediterranean shrub, and one of the strategies some Mediterranean shrubs use to tolerate drought is they drop all their leaves in summer. So they will do that. It will defoliate in the middle of summer and then refoliate when it starts to rain in the fall. It's worth a go in the warmer parts of the county. Contorted hazelnuts, these are very hardy plants. Some of them are sensitive to eastern filbert blight. This is one of those. This is Corylus avellana contorta. There are newer ones available from OSU, which are also red-leaved and contorted as part of the hazelnut breeding program at OSU. So look for those. So this is the kind of effect you get, though, in the middle of winter, a deciduous shrub and then these twisted stems with these dangling catkins. So again, it's a really textural shrub. And here's an example of a red catkin one and also red foliage, this one called Red Majestic. The one from OSU, the contorted red one, is called Red Dragon. So that is eastern filbert blight resistant, which is a bad disease for hazelnuts. I included this here. This is a vine, not a actual shrub, but if you're interested in clematis, this is a winter flowering species, Clematis cirrhosa. It's Mediterranean in origin, so it's also very drought tolerant. So we think of clematis as being, something that you want to irrigate during the growing season. This is a Mediterranean form, so it is hardy enough to grow in zone 7. Again, it flowers in January and February. So this is a little trellis in our garden upon which I've trained it. And if you go to the Rogerson clematis collection in Lake Oswego, they have a collection of these growing on these little trellises. And this shows another one here, Clematis cirrhosa freckles. And this shows the flowers on that, and it's named freckles, of course, for these little dots on the interior of the petals. So there's quite a few different cultivars of Clematis cirrhosa out there, and these are explicitly winter blooming vines. Very cool. This is one of the better known winter flowering shrubs that we can grow, and it's very tough. Sweet box. So the two main species that you'll find are Sarcococca confusa and Sarcococca hookeriana. They're evergreen shrubs, in some cases a little bit suckering, but they're very tidy. They flower in the dead of winter. The flowers are very fragrant on both these species. So this is the Sarcococca confusa. You can see the sort of characteristic leaf shape, little diminutive white flowers. The scent is the attraction on these. They are very fragrant and probably one of the better known winter flowering fragrant shrubs, and one of the more commonly used as well. The other species is Sarcococca hookeriana, which has these longer, narrower leaves and very similar flowers, also very fragrant. So very tough. The thing about these is they're probably best placed in shade. They're not really plants for sun. So if you have a shady spot where you're looking for something tolerant of dry shade that's also winter fragrant, this would be a great choice. Very prunable as well. So here are the leaves and the flowers of Sarcococca hookeriana. Manzanitas, so moving along to manzanitas. Manzanitas are sort of the classic shrub of the West. They're distributed all the way from British Columbia all the way down into California and Mexico. Possibly the best known one is one of the more diminutive ones, and that's Kinnikinic, which is Arctostaphylos uva ursi. So this is typically seen as a ground cover. It's also one of the most widely distributed manzanitas, if you like. It's circumpolar in distribution, so you'll find it in northern North America as well as northern Asia. It's also one of the least drought tolerant of the Kinnikinics. In our trial, one of the more commonly grown forms of Kinnikinic is called Massachusetts, which is not, of course, from the West. It's actually a cultivar selected from seed from the eastern North America. So whereas most manzanitas are thought of being very drought tolerant, Massachusetts Kinnikinic will need or will prefer some summer irrigation. So that's something to keep in mind about Kinnikinic, is that because it has such a wide distribution, you really want to find a form for the drought-tolerant garden that's probably closer to Western Oregon in origin than a place like Eastern North America. The forms from Western North America will be much more drought-tolerant. The other manzanita, which is native to Western Oregon and in the gorge, is hairy manzanita or Arctostaphylos columbiana. So both of those can be found in the gorge in various locations, and obviously selections from that area would be ideal. There are, of course, also manzanitas which are not native to our area. They range all over the West. Some of the larger shrubby forms are renowned for their branching and also the bark effect that they give. So the larger forms of manzanita are really grown partly for the foliage and the flowers, but also for this amazing bark and branching effect. Flowers may be white and they may be pink. The bloom season depends completely on which species and cultivar you choose. Some begin blooming in December, others remain dormant until blooming in April. So depending on the manzanita you choose, you can have a long period of bloom. And pollinators, like honeybees, again, on warm days, are very attracted to the flowers in midwinter when no native shrubs are in bloom. The other thing which will love you for planting manzanitas are hummingbirds, which are really attracted to flowers of manzanitas. And the name, of course, manzanita is Spanish for little apple, which is what the fruit look like, especially when they're young. So if you're going to choose a native one, well, you can't do better than hairy manzanita. This is a nicely pruned form. And so it forms a nice rounded shrub. Depending on which one you choose, it forms a nice shrub to a medium-sized shrub, I guess, maybe 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide, blooming in mid-spring. This shows a form which we grew in our evaluation in Aurora. This is Arctostaphylos nummularia, which is a dwarf evergreen shrub growing to about 2 feet by about 4 feet. A little bit larger than that is Arctostaphylos hookeri, which grows to about 4 feet by about 6 to 8 feet. And this shows a select form called wayside. There's a number of forms of these. These are hardy to zone 8. They will suffer tip damage if it does get cold enough. In other words, tip damage to the shoots, but have proven to be pretty hardy overall in our area. And another one which I like because it was always in bloom in January is Arctostaphylos sentinel, which is a large shrub about 8 to 10 feet tall and as wide. So again, kind of like the silk tassel, this one needs space, but it's a heavy bloomer and attracts hummingbirds like you wouldn't believe. Beautiful plant in full bloom for about a month in the middle of winter. Later on in spring, this photograph, by the way, is taken of a Oregon grape, which is one of our signature early blooming native shrubs. And this is over at Mosier, at the trailhead for the, is it Mosier Headlands or Mosier, I can't remember the name of the hike, but anyway, it's right there at the parking lot for in Mosier. So it's one of the most beautiful forms of Oregon grape I think I've ever seen. So yellow flowers, evergreen shrub, and of course the signature fruit, the Oregon grape itself, which are born later on in the year. There are other forms of this out there. There are some hybrid or select forms. This is one called Apollo. Oregon grape itself gets to be quite large, maybe 6 feet tall. Some of these select forms are quite a bit smaller than that. So there's a lot of variations on Oregon grape. And what you get though is those yellow flowers and that textural, stiff evergreen foliage. And then also what you get is that hint of purple in the foliage in the wintertime. So it exhibits one of those color changes, which is always kind of nice in response to cold weather. One of the earliest blooming shrubs for Western Oregon is osoberry. So this will come into bloom on bare stems. Usually in this year, it came into bloom over here in late February, which is unusual. Usually we associate it with bloom in the first to second week of March. Anyway, the earliest woody shrub to put on bloom. The flowers are white and borne in clusters, and later on they bear the berry itself, which is blue when ripe and apparently edible. But if you leave them long enough, the birds will come and happily take them all for you. So this is a great habitat plant for native birds. Rosemary, of course, now that has undergone a name change. It used to be Rosmarinus officinalis. Now it's been lumped in with salvias, so it's now known as Salvia rosmarinus. But it's a Mediterranean shrub. There's many, many, many cultivars. So the upright forms are hardier, and typically those which we would choose for gardens in our area. This is a cultivar of the sort of light blue flowers called ARP. But as I said, they're all variations on a theme, very aromatic, deer-proof evergreen shrubs with whitish to blue flowers. The evergreen trailing forms are significantly less hardy overall than the more upright growing forms. So when you're choosing a rosemary, that's just something to keep in mind. Trailing forms are way more susceptible to cold injury. Currants. So again, speaking of native plants, the flowering currant is one of the showiest native flowering shrubs in Western Oregon, Ribes sanguineum. So these are deciduous shrubs with an upright growth habit to about 8–10 feet tall and as wide. There are pink, there are white, and there are also bright red forms out there. And again, hummingbirds can simply not get enough of this plant, as is the case with pollinators of various kinds. And then there's also the clove currant, native to the gorge. And so that's named for the scent of its flowers. This photo is of a form taken in Eastern Oregon, but it's got a wide range in Oregon with these yellow, very highly scented flowers. So that one is unique for its fragrance, as well as the color of the flowers. This one might be worth a go. This is actually a native of California. It's called fuchsia flowered gooseberry, Ribes speciosum. Should be hardy enough for parts of Hood River County. And so it's, again, a summer deciduous shrub that leaves out in the fall when it starts to green up. And then the flowers are named for their appearance of sort of fuchsia-like, which come on in late April and, late March and April. And so hummingbirds just adore these things and will dangle, poking their beak up into these flowers. And when this is in bloom, the hummingbirds won't leave it alone. So a really good hummingbird plant. I put this in here in case you just have a large wild space in the garden to occupy with 1 or 2 shrubs. This is serviceberry, sometimes known as Saskatoon. But anyway, Amelanchier alnifolia in the rose family is a large growing evergreen, deciduous shrub with these white flowers in the spring, which are followed by these edible berries in the middle of summer. So these are actually quite good if you can get them. Sometimes these are quite prone to rust diseases, which destroy the fruit, but if you can get one which is not prone to that, the fruit quality is very good. Thyme, so again, now we're into mid to late spring. One of the hardier forms of thyme, which is a Mediterranean herb, of course, is Thymus vulgaris. And this is also one of the taller growing forms, so better for ground cover. So growing to about 2 feet tall and about 4 feet wide. These will attract pollinators of all kinds, and of course, especially European honeybees to the flowers. So you'll literally be able to hear this plant before you actually see it because of all the insect activity. Really tough evergreen shrub. Rock roses, again, I mentioned we did a trial of these, so we evaluated a number of them. There's definitely differences in hardiness in these plants, so you want to get some of the hardier ones. A lot of them are rounded evergreen shrubs. They're all evergreen shrubs, sort of rounded habit in some cases. A few of them have a more upright habit, but this is what you get, a really good weed smothering plant for unirrigated parts of the garden. As you can see, the lawn's gone dormant, but the shrub is still alive and well. Flowers are these sort of paper crepe type petals on these flowers, which last 1 day. So the flowers open in the morning and then the petals fall off in the afternoon, but then new flowers open the following day. So it has actually a reasonably long bloom period. So the flowers can be white, they can be white with spots, or in some cases they can be pink. And honeybees, again, in particular, are very attracted to these flowers. And then the other genus is Hylimnium, which is a related genus, also known as a rock rose. And these are a little bit different in that many of them have yellow flowers, in some cases with the spots at the bottom of the petal. And often the foliage is a bit more silvery than on cistus. So the most commonly grown ones are Cistus hybridus, which is an evergreen shrub to about 4 feet by 6 feet, hardy to zone 7. And then Cistus purpureus, as the name suggests, with purple flowers. Again, about a 5 to 6 foot tall to 6 to 8 foot tall, wide plant. So give this one lots of space. They do tolerate some pruning, but always it's better to give an evergreen shrub like that the space that it wants. This is a much more diminutive plant. This is Cistus pulverulentus sunset. Got the most brilliant colored flowers, sort of a magenta colored flower, and a smaller plant too, only growing to about 2 feet by 4 feet. So for smaller spaces, this is a better choice. And it's also got one of the longer bloom periods of Cistus as well. So this is a good one. And then Hylimnium lasianthum, if you're looking for a Hylimnium, this one grows to about, again, 2 feet tall by about 4 feet wide and has that characteristic silver foliage and the yellow flower with the blotch at the base of each petal. This is a Cistus obtusifolius. This is one of the more interesting plants that came out of our evaluation. It's a rounded shrub to about 3 feet tall and 3 to 4 feet across. So it fits in places that Cistus hybridus simply would not, because it's a much smaller plant, as hardy as Cistus hybridus and with the same white flowers. So this was a good plant in our evaluation. And if you're looking for a more upright form that's worth a go, this is Cistus aguileri maculatus, which has, as I mentioned, a more upright growing habit, sort of an upright arching habit, but with these huge white flowers with a blotch at the base of each petal. So this is a really showy shrub, which is in bloom right now. So early June. There's also a related genus called Helianthemum. These are known as sun roses. This is just one example of these. So this is Helianthemum nummularium belgravia rose. There's a huge range of cultivars of this species, and notice that it's much hardier than the Cistus are. This is hardy to zone 5. So you can find pink, you can find white, you can find yellow forms of this. So if you're looking for a much smaller shrub, these only get to be about a foot to maybe 18 inches tall by a couple of feet across. These are much smaller, much hardier, and a much wider range of colors in the blooms. So a different plant altogether. Spanish lavender, we'll talk a little bit more about lavender later on. The earliest of the lavenders to bloom is Spanish lavender. So an evergreen shrub, very aromatic, of course, deer-proof, much beloved by bumblebees in particular. Well, these are in bloom now. So a typical shrub, there's a number of different cultivars, of course, a plant to 2.5 to 3 feet tall and about as wide. Very nice, very tidy plants. Wild lilacs, or ceanothus. These are native. There's some native choices amongst the wild lilacs. This is deer brush, which is native to the gorge, Ceanothus integerimus. And then also red stem ceanothus, which is a large shrub. Ceanothus sanguineus is native to the gorge as well. So there's some native options in the ceanothus, and ceanothus are incredible pollinator plants. They attract pollinators of all kinds when they're in bloom. So a really good plant for pollinators. So this shows the flower clusters on Ceanothus sanguineus. There's also some non-native ceanothus. These are mostly evergreen shrubs from Southern Oregon and Northern California. The best known of which is probably Ceanothus thursiflorus victoria, which is a large evergreen shrub, 8 to 10 feet tall, 8 to 10 feet across. It will tolerate some pruning, but again, best placed where it can be given the space to grow. Blue flowers in late May and early June. Really tough stuff. And then the other one, which is commonly grown in cultivation, is point raised ceanothus, which is completely different. It's a ground cover. This is Ceanothus gloriosus, which again is hardy to about zone 8, but again with blue flowers. But if you're looking for a ground cover, which requires no irrigation, then this is a good choice. And this is one of the earlier blooming ones. This is Ceanothus blue jeans. This is also one of the tougher ones. We found this to be very hardy over here. I'd never seen cold injury to it. So again, for the warmer parts of the county, I think it's worth a go. It's one of the first ones to bloom, usually around late March or very certainly early April. It will be in bloom, and it's just covered with blue flowers. Just a really amazing plant. And a little bit hardier and a little bit later blooming is these hybrid types. This is Ceanothus delilianus. This is a form called Gloire de Versailles. And these bloom on new wood, so these will more typically come into bloom in June and even into July. So this is a way to extend the bloom period of Ceanothus later in the growing season. And these will be just that much hardier than the evergreen types. These are sort of semi-evergreen. Brooms, not the weedy broom that we're familiar with, Cytisus. This is carpet broom, which makes a very tidy ground cover. And there's two main forms grown. This is Genista lydia, again with yellow flowers in spring. And this is the other carpet broom, Genista pilosa, which is quite a bit hardier. So if you're looking for a ground cover, yellow blooms over about a week in late spring. For a colder part of the county, then this would be the one to go with. Genista lydia is just not quite as hardy as Genista pilosa, but you get the same sort of variation. Evergreen shrub, yellow flowers, very, very tough. Jerusalem sage, this is probably the best known of the so-called Jerusalem sages. This is Phlomis fruticosa. There's a number of different species of these Mediterranean plants, but this is probably the best known. It's an evergreen shrub which develops these yellow flowers on these stalks, kind of like a lavender, I guess you could say, held above the foliage. So they have a way of starting to flower and then sprawling outwards from the foliage, and this is the kind of effect that you get. And again, it's in the mint family, so bumblebees are very attracted to flowers on this one. There are many species of this. This is just one other. This is a purple Phlomis, Phlomis purpurea, which rather than having the yellow flowers, has the same kind of growth habit. And you can see how the flower structures are. They're these long clusters of flowers on a stick, so to speak, and they'll tend to fall over. But these produce purple flowers. Very good, very tough shrubs. This is a close-up of the flower clusters. Snowberry, again, one of our native shrubs, one of the longer blooming native shrubs as well, but it's deciduous. It's a suckering plant, so it will sucker politely over a short distance every year, forming a sort of a colony, never getting higher than about 3 to 4 feet. Seems to be happy in sun or shade, very tolerant of drought, and named, of course, for the white fruit that the flowers produce. So this is what the plants look like in leaf. And then you see it's got a very long bloom period because we've got fruit formed, and yet there's still flowers coming on here. And so this will continue to bloom into August, actually. So it's got a long bloom period. Bumblebees adore these flowers and will dangle from these tiny flowers. The bumblebees are about 4 times the size of the flowers. So it's quite a sight to see them hanging on there, pollinating the flowers. And so in full fruit, they look like this. Not edible for humans, but birds do eat the fruit. I put this in here partly for the name, hairy canary clover. This is a Mediterranean evergreen shrub, a short-lived evergreen shrub which tends to reseed itself politely, not, in other words, just in and around where the mother plant was, but it produces these little pink flowers in early summer. So a Dorycnium hirsutum, a silvery evergreen shrub, good for a sort of a massing ground cover in a sunny area. And then lavenders. I mean, we could just do an entire presentation on lavenders. The bloom period totally depends on the lavender one chooses and the cultivar. Again, these will have a long bloom period in July and August. And again, bumblebees are very, very, very highly attracted to the flowers of really any lavender. And oreganos as well. It's, of course, thought of as a culinary herb, but it's a large genus of evergreen shrubs from the Mediterranean region, very aromatic. Not all of them are used for the culinary purposes, but some of them can be used as ornamentals. Here's an example. This is Origanum laevigatum, hardy to zone 8. And there's also these hop-flowered types. This is Origanum Kent Beauty. And another one, which it's amazing to think they're all oreganos, but this is Origanum rotundifolium. So all of these are small shrubs for sort of small areas or tight little spots, and hardy to about zone 8. And of course, quite aromatic in many cases. Roses, we could spend, of course, another presentation just talking about roses. These are just some examples. Obviously, all the native roses are going to be, at least native roses that are growing in dry areas are going to be hardy. This is Rosa nutcana, very showy plant in bloom right now. And then there's also all sorts of old roses. When I talk about roses, I'm not discussing sort of hybrid tea or other roses that bloom on new wood, which really need summer irrigation in order to keep growing, in order to keep flowering. And I wouldn't consider to be particularly drought tolerant. But the old roses, the once flowering roses, are really, really tough plants. So there are nurseries that specialize in these things. This is just a moss type rose that we grow in our garden that never gets any summer irrigation and doesn't mind it one little bit. Here's another one that I got years ago. It's very fragrant. And of course, you're going to grow an old rose. You want something that's fragrant. Keep in mind that most of these roses do sucker, so site them appropriately and be prepared to dig suckers that appear where you don't want them. But again, this is another rose that doesn't receive any irrigation. And here's one more, a freestanding arching rose, which we grow in our garden, which gets to be about 15 feet tall and just about as wide when it's in bloom. And it's in bloom right now. Eddie's Jewel, a single red, non-fragrant flowers. Simply incredible in bloom. So lots and lots of rose options, especially if you're choosing amongst the tough old ones. Another native shrub, which will be in bloom in about 3 weeks or so, is ocean spray. So an upright, arching native shrub with these clusters of white flowers, which are really, really attractive to all sorts of native pollinators. These plants will really be a buzz when they're in bloom. Sage, this one is again the culinary, this is the Mediterranean shrub, sage, Salvia officinalis, the sage, if you like, the herbal sage. So there's lots of different forms of this. It forms a tidy little group of evergreen leaves to about 18 inches tall and about 3 feet across, and then produces these clusters of flowers in July. And there's also this other form called purpurea, which as the name suggests, more purple sort of tinge to the foliage, but tough Mediterranean shrubs. Russian sage, I'm sure all of you have seen at some point or another. This is a sub-shrub, so to speak, so it can be cut back hard in late winter, or if it's damaged by winter, cold, it tends to jump right back in the spring, and then produces these sprays of blue flowers in late July and August. So it's got a long bloom period, and again, very attractive to pollinators and very hardy as well, zone 6. Lavender cottons is another genus, Santolina, of Mediterranean plants. And these are in the aster family, but they do not produce the same flowers as the daisy. So you don't get the ray flowers, you just get the head of flowers in Santolina. So it produces these sort of button-like inflorescences, which can be white or can be yellow. So this is Santolina chamaecyparis, which produces yellow flowers. It has this very grayish foliage. So it's a really nice contrast between the yellow color of the head flowers and then that silvery foliage. And this is what it looks like in bloom. But there are many other options for Santolinas, and this is just one more. This is Santolina pinnata, a form called Edward Bowles, which has white flowers. So a lot of Santolinas out there. I've never seen one of these injured, regardless of how cold it got here. So they're definitely hardy into zone 7. Yuccas, so getting into late summer here. Yucca, this is probably Yucca gloriosa, I'm not sure. But these are very tough shrubs, which texturally, of course, are completely different from anything else we've talked about. And they produce these spikes of white flowers in late summer. Very tough, very showy and very architectural plants. Here's another example, Yucca rostrata, this one called Sapphire Skies, which is reputedly hardy to zone 8. So if you're looking for a spiky feature in your garden, by golly, here's a possibility. And there are lots of other yuccas, and this is just one more example. This is in Corvallis, Yucca whipplei, Our Lord's Candle, which produces these huge inflorescences rising above that little cluster of leaves. It's hard to believe such a large inflorescence comes from such a small plant, but there you go, the evidence to prove it. Later on in summer, another southeastern European shrub, chaste tree, Vitex agnus castus. Again, an incredible pollinator plant. It will attract all manner of pollinators to the flowers, which appear in August and even into September. So these spikes of blue flowers will be just covered with all sorts of pollinators at that time of the year. A deciduous shrub with these sort of gray-green leaves. And this is California fuchsia, Epilobium canem. These are suffering subshrubs, which can be, again, much like the Russian sage, can be cut back in the springtime to rejuvenate the planting, and they bloom on new growth, as you'd expect for something that comes into bloom in August, and will continue into September. So these produce red, or in some cases white, or possibly pink flowers in abundance in late summer. And as you can imagine, this red tube-shaped flower is incredibly attractive to hummingbirds and also other pollinators. But hummingbirds will appreciate having this. And there's a range of cultivars of these, some of which have these very silvery leaves. So you get this great effect of red flowers with this silver foliage as summer draws to a close. Another really unique plant, which is from the Mediterranean, And is in the carrot family is this oddly named plant called shrubby hare's ear. It's Buplurum fruticosum. And it starts to bloom in late August and into September. And it has these clusters of carrot-like yellow flowers, which oddly enough are quite attractive to bald-faced hornets, which you see right there. So I guess keep this away from kids, but if you're looking for a shrub which is completely unique, then this fits the bill. And again, much like the California fuchsia, because all of these things at this time of the year are blooming on current season's wood, they can tolerate a hard pruning early in the season or suffer some winter injury and still bounce back. But it is still hardy to zone 7. Coyote brush, this is a Oregon coastal native, which is sort of creeping into the Willamette Valley. It's an evergreen shrub. So it says this is an example which is sort of mat forming, and it produces these white flowers. Again, this is in the aster family, but it lacks those ray flowers on the inflorescence. It only has the disc flowers on the center of the head. So this is what the plant looks like in bloom. But these have the most interesting scent. It's actually a very pleasant sort of combination. One person referred to it, I remember reading, as a combination of hay and honey, which is kind of warm and kind of pleasing. So these will start blooming in early September and into October. And so they have a fairly long bloom time, again, on current season's wood. This is a form which is ground cover called Twin Peaks. And this is a selection from California, which is probably a little bit tender, even for the Willamette Valley. So if it were to be used, you'd want to hope for some snow cover maybe to protect it during the coldest periods of the winter. But there are some dwarf forms out there. There are also forms which are more upright and rounded of this particular species. Very interesting late blooming plant. And then the last plant to carry us into the fall is strawberry tree, which again is a Mediterranean native. This is an example which is growing, or was growing, up at the North Willamette Research and Extension Center where my trials are, and it was originally planted in 1969. And it's called strawberry tree for a reason, because the full-size plant is a good 15 feet tall and probably 20 to 25 feet across. So they're huge plants. But they produce these bell-shaped type flowers, which are followed by red fruits. This is a smaller example. There are dwarf forms out there. This is in Bush Park in Salem, and it's one of the tidier forms of this plant that I've seen. And I took the photo in October when the plant is both in bloom and also in fruit. So it's called strawberry tree because of these red fruits, which are theoretically edible. And so, yeah, these decorate the tree in the fall as well. So that's what I've got. This would this particular plant's bloom time would overlap with that of the, or come close to overlapping with that of chaparral currant. So it would be a way of providing bloom throughout the growing season. There are dwarf forms of it available. This is one called Elfin King. So you don't have to have a 20-foot by 30-foot plant in your garden after a few years. There are options out there for something smaller. I will just bring your attention to this book by a French author by the name of Olivier Philippi. He is a sort of an advocate, if you like, of the use of ground covers for dry gardens. He does live in the Mediterranean part of France, so of course he's talking about many plants which are not hardy enough to grow in Western Oregon or in the gorge. But what is interesting about this book is just the read for the sort of the philosophy and practicality and approach to landscaping without water. So if you haven't read it or you're not familiar with it, this is a good overview of how to design a garden for low irrigation or no irrigation. Even if not all the plants would be appropriate, the other approaches are definitely appropriate. So that's what I have for you. I hope I kept it within time, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions that anyone has. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Neil.
Yeah, I kind of
there were so many plants. That's great.
Yeah, that's a lot of plants. I really flew through all that, but if anyone has any follow-up questions as well, you can certainly email me, and I'll be happy to elaborate on any questions you might have. But I'll take any questions now as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and if anybody wants to add more questions to the Q&A, we just have one. Well, we had one comment that was, you are looking for the name of the Mosier Trail. It's the Mosier Plateau Trailhead. So there
That's
you go.
it. Yes. Thank you. Wonderful trail.
It is. It's beautiful.
And that, honestly, that is the most perfectly shaped Oregon grape I've ever seen. They're usually not that full and not that shapely, you know, be honest with you. So to see one growing in the wild like that, so to speak, was pretty amazing. And to catch it in full bloom in April as well.
Okay, perfect. And then we had, when you were talking about the ceanothus, I don't know if I pronounced that correct, we had a question if there were any blue flowering ceanothuses that are hardy to zone 6. You had gotten to zone 7.
Yeah, so the hardiest ones that are blue are going to be those hybrid ones, Ceanothus dililianus, and there are different cultivars of that out there. Topaz is one, so you could see if you could find one of those. Again, this is a plant which is semi-evergreen. They bloom on new wood. So this is an advantage for colder climates in that even if they get knocked back by winter cold, because they bloom on new wood, as long as the bases of the stems are still alive, then they can produce shoot growth and they will produce flowers. You can't say that of the evergreen types that bloom earlier in the growing season, like blue jeans and others. They will suffer winter injury in some cases over here. Blue jeans never has, so that's a hardy evergreen one. But your best bet for colder growing regions is the later blooming ones, like the hybrid ones that bloom on new wood. And of course, the native ones will bloom on new wood and will be hardy as well. There is blue flowered forms of Ceanothus integerrimus as well. I think the ones that are native are probably going to be white, but you know, there might be blue options because that species ranges way down into California. It's got a wide range. So there are blue forms of that. But I'd say your best bet is going to be something like Gloire de Versailles, Topaz, or some other form of Ceanothus dililianus.
Okay. And to kind of follow up on that regarding zones, if you live in zone 6, we have a question, can you plant zone 7 plants okay? Or like, what are your risks that you're getting into there?
Okay, so if you live in live in a zone lower than the hardiness rating of the plant, and again, these are kind of guidelines, I'd be the last person to say don't give it a try, because that's what I do up in North Willamette, is plant all sorts of things which don't turn out to be hardy. And we just plant them and see what happens. And sometimes we get surprised. So, you know, it's worth a go, but I would keep in mind that there are ways to place plants which may be a little bit tender, or you're a little concerned about the hardiness, such that they'll gain the benefit of a protected spot in the garden. So, you know, we can do that, and we can sometimes be surprised. Warm surfaces like sides of buildings and so forth provide a lot of protection if the sun is striking those walls during the winter. The plant will benefit from that added heat during the night. So it's worth a go.
Okay. And then will there be a set like plant list that you've kind of mentioned this plant list? Is this a document that we'll be receiving that we can share out to everybody?
I can put together a plant list and I can forward it to you. And then if, you know, either put it on the extension office website for people to grab, or email directly, whatever works. But I have an existing plant list for a similar presentation. I just need to make a few changes to reflect the adaptations, if you like, that I made for the gorge.
Perfect. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then it looks like maybe we have time for one more question. We've got, what is the name of the 6 to 8 foot height, or 6 to 8 by 4 to 6 bush that has dark green leaves and deep blue periwinkle flowers that blooms in summer? Quizzing you. Deep blue periwinkle flowers. Maybe we'll have to look through the flower list and get back to Renee on that one.
Well, hang on.
Okay.
I could go back and let's have a look. Let's see, how do I do this? periwinkle type flowers. I'm not sure. Are you seeing the one that you're, so you said midsummer.
Mhm.
That would be, this is
Maybe
midsummer in here.
to follow up for Renee, is it a plant that he showed, or is it one that you are seeing out in the world that you're looking for an answer or for a name for? Because maybe it's not on this list.
Has it got blue periwinkle flowers right now? Because that would be periwinkle.
Oh, yep, she said she saw it in Hood River.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so that's vinca. I don't include, it's a vine, it's a ground cover. It's also a bit weedy. So speaking of the Mosier Trail, Plateau Trail, if you go to the graveyard, I mean, it's growing in there. It's a Mediterranean evergreen vine, I guess, but it's often found as a ground cover, but in shady areas. So in sunny areas, it often gets chlorotic, which it will in that location as well. So, okay, so it's Vinca major is the species. Periwinkle is the common name. Yeah, I don't include it because it's a little bit of a weed, to be honest with you. But it's impressive that it's hardy. I remember seeing it at that very location in bloom and been impressed with the fact that it was growing too happily there. But that's what that is.
Okay.
Sorry, I was confused by that.
That's okay. Yeah, it looks like we've got somebody that says that, yeah, in the gorge it does look like Vinca major is pretty invasive in the gorge.
Yeah.
And not super recommended.
Not only in the gorge.
Not only in the gorge. Perfect. And then if there are any other questions that we didn't get to, we will respond via email. But I wanted to say thank you again for the wonderful presentation. Our next presentation will be on June 17th, and you can register for that the same place that you did on the Columbia or Central Gorge Master Gardeners website blog. Thank you again, Neil, and I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everybody.